Thanks for coming out. This is the opening of the Simply Living Fair for 2004. This is our 6th year. And this year we're going back to the format which we started with for the first 4 years. After experimenting last year with the Pioneers Conference and combining the two, this year we've actually got the best of both worlds. We have the Simply Living Fair in its original format. And next month we have the Pioneers Conference here at IU. And thanks to David Haberman and Heather Reynolds, I'd like to give a hand to them. Is Heather here? Where's Heather? No. Okay. Well, they've been spearheading this effort to get IU to actually pay the conference fees so that we can bring Pioneers through satellite to the IU campus and educate some of these young students on the immense alternatives that are popping up around the world right now through really ingenious people who are combining biology and technology, and not in ways like genetic engineering, but in ways that work with the earth to heal the earth and to heal ourselves. And so that's happening next month. There's some information out on the table if you're interested in the Pioneers.
And this year it's free and open to everyone.
It's free and open to everyone. I'd like to take a minute to thank the 4 sponsoring organizations for the Simply Living Fair: Blooming Foods, Cooperative, we have City Parks and Rec Department, and Heartwood and the Center for Sustainable Living. We certainly could not put this event together without all 4 of these organizations. Everybody brings very vital energy and time and resources to put this whole event together. It takes us pretty much a whole year to plan for the Simply Living Fair, and so we'll start again next month for next year. So thank you for coming tonight. I want to not be too long up here because you came to see Marti Crouch speak, and she is our honorable guest tonight, here to speak with us about weeds and plants and our relationships with the natural world. In this increasingly technology-driven world, our connections with the earth have become weaker and weaker. And there's a great misunderstanding about much of what goes on out there, out there in the woods and in the swamps and in the rainforests, and out there where a lot of people don't tend to go anymore. Out there in the real world, which is really the real world. Not to be confused with the real world that your parents tell you about when you finish school or whatever. The great and beautiful, the full of mystery natural world where plants and trees and animals and fungi and lichens and insects and everything else coexist in the magical and wondrous dance of life. Retired biology professor Marti Crouch received her doctorate in biology from Yale University. She's joining us here tonight to speak on, the title is Weeds Shall Overcome, Ending Our War on Nature. So I think she probably might touch upon the similarities between our war on nature and the war on each other that we have in this world right now. And Marti was a born botanist, she claims. Her grandfather was a raspberry farmer, her grandmother was a mushroom hunter, and her father was a florist. She eventually concluded that after, I guess I'm skipping a little bit, after going to Yale, she came to IU to teach and do research, and she was doing that for a number of years. She finally got tenure, and she took a year off to just think things through, and she took a year off from teaching. She was still doing the research. And it gave her some time to think about what exactly she was doing with her time. And she started to realize that she concluded that basically 99 of the 100 improvements in agri-technology used by agribusiness would result in a competitive disadvantage for subsistence and peasant farmers. She decided in 1989 to quit her genetic engineering research, which she had quite an extensive lab at IU. She made a big decision to shut the lab down and to quit the experimental research and do something of direct social relevance. And since then, she's been a big influence in a lot of people's lives. She's touched my life quite a bit over the years. I came here as a student in 1992 and met Marti, I think later that year or the next year, through the Rainforest Action Group, the Bloomington Rainforest Action Group, which she had started a few years earlier. That was my introduction to environmentalism. Before I came to IU, I didn't know what environmental, I never even heard of that word before. So I had quite an introduction through Marti and learning from her about rainforests. And ever since then, I've evolved in my learning and my thinking, and come to understand quite a bit about the natural world just through life. I didn't go to school to learn about biology, but I've just learned a lot through living. Marti is concerned these days with maintaining the maximum amounts of cultural and biological diversity in life. And she's focusing her attention now on issues pertaining to the relationship between people and plants, both in agriculture and in nature, such as the relationships that we have with the troubling relationships that are being discovered by genetic researchers, genetically engineered crops, and all the weed wars and our fight against invasive plants. She has a deep respect for the relationship between indigenous people and their environment, and she's here to speak with us tonight about our relationship with the natural world. Please help me welcome Marti Couch.
Thanks to the organizers for inviting me to speak this evening, and to all of you, my friends and neighbors, for coming out. It's a big responsibility to speak in my hometown. There's more accountability for words because they'll bounce around in the community for a while. I hope I express myself clearly and in an engaging way, and that I don't offend anyone while speaking my own truths. Let me be clear that my thoughts tonight are my own, in as much as anyone has an original thought, and do not reflect the views of the various sponsors of the Simply Living Fair. Tonight I want to take weeds seriously. As important members of our community and world, I'm enthusiastic about these common plants. And I've been interacting with weeds for about 45 years. Every year my respect for them deepens. So it makes me sad, and I become actually despondent walking around town and driving around the countryside when I see the weed wars that are going on in the farms, gardens, golf courses, lawns, rangelands, and even in our natural areas. It doesn't really surprise me because our culture here is so war oriented in all its aspects. And even people, when they're attempting, and I include myself in this, attempting to be alternative in our thinking and our living, a lot of times we end up falling into the patterns of warriors because it's really the main thing that we know here. So how can we make peace in any way on earth, but particularly with weeds? I have a few stories to tell, and that's what I want to talk about tonight. When I started preparing for this talk, I decided that I wanted to tell you everything I learned in 45 years about weeds. And when I wrote it down, it took about 3 days to deliver. So I've pared it down quite a bit. I'm hoping it'll take less than an hour. And I want to start by talking about something that I saw down by Blooming Foods. When I walk out of the house to go out into the world, I go into a state of attention because I feel like what I'm doing out in the world is greeting and interacting with all of the beings that I pass. I name the plants and the birds and the animals as I walk past them and try and notice if anything is different from the last time I saw them. I notice the quality of the light, the way the clouds are moving, the smell of the air. To me, the shrubs and the flowers are not just a backdrop for my life. They're part of the play. They're actors in the play. And so I try and develop this, this feeling of being together with the things that I'm passing by as I walk in the world. Which means I notice quite a few things, I think, although I'm always trying to become better at that. So the other day I was walking through town and I came across a graffiti. Now I think graffiti has quite a similarity with weeds popping up in waste places. And I saw this stenciled on the side of a parking barricade, a concrete parking barricade near the co-op. I took a picture of it, and if I can have the lights down just for a second, just to see if we can see this, the first slide. If you could put that, can you see the forward button in there, David? Can you see that? Flies keep trying to warn me of the apocalypse. I brush them away. Flies keep trying to warn me of the apocalypse. I brush them away. Okay, if I can have the lights back and turn off the slide. Yeah, let's have the room lights on for the talk so that there's a better chance we don't fall asleep. Wow, these flies have a big message, big news. And yet, what are flies? They're pesky disease carriers, and they have little tiny brains. So how can they carry a message of this importance? I thought, I really thought of this, and I thought, well, maybe it's just that we're noticing a change, there's an increase in flies, and so maybe there are corpses piling up somewhere near here. And I would be reading the signs of nature to notice that there are more flies than usual. And that would indicate to me that there might be an apocalypse. But that's not really what this graffiti says. It says the flies come to warn me. So they're actively bringing the message. It's not just that I notice the changes in nature. Now, as an aside, I don't actually believe in the apocalypse. That's a specific cataclysmic event where the earth is destroyed as God smites the evildoers and raises the righteous to heaven. But I do believe in cataclysmic change. And it appears that the earth and our peoples have been through cataclysms for our entire history. I also think that most of us here in the United States, besides being informed in our views of the world by warfare, we're also informed by visions of the apocalypse, whether we're believers or not. Our country was founded and historically grounded in millennial people who believed strongly in this and were preparing for it, setting up cities on the hill, actively preparing for this. And I think it's in the background of our thought, and that as environmentalists, often I think we jump to apocalyptic visions quite easily because of that and need to be on guard for it. But back to this little graffiti. The person just brushes them away, just brushes the flies away, doesn't even swat them. So you can't get much more casual than just brushing them away. The sense is that such casual dismissal of this lowly messenger was unwise, that perhaps the person could escape the approaching cataclysm in time, but now maybe not, because they just brushed them away. The lesson here, maybe we should learn how to listen to nature as if it was an active source of information, and I'm not really sure how to do that. I'll talk a little bit about that more later. And it probably isn't very easy in a mechanistic society where nature is relegated to the backdrop, but our lives may in fact depend on it. So weeds, like flies, are lowly creatures. What exactly are weeds? I'll give you two of my favorite definitions that relate to what I'm going to talk about. The first definition is from my colleague, Professor Emeritus Charles Heiser, from his recent book, Weeds in My Garden, Observations on Some Misunderstood Plants. Charlie and I have tea once a week and talk a lot about weeds. He says a weed is a plant that grows in places in some way disturbed by man. And then he says, of course, now I would say people. And then I would amend that to say, well, maybe man. Or his domesticated animals. The disturbed places are roadsides, cultivated fields, vacant lots, and other waste places. So, according to Charlie's definition, weeds are hitched to the human wagon. A plant that grows in a disturbed area that wasn't disturbed by people, by this definition, would be a wildflower. Although, when humans create a disturbance and that plant grows in it, then it's a weed. So he really links it with people. Examples would be ragweed, pokeweed, poison ivy, all native weeds, meaning that they were here before humans came to North America. And then the other weeds came with immigrants and spread along travel routes and with agriculture, things like dandelions, plantain, and white clover. The list is very long. The second definition broadens the idea of weeds to include weedy animals as well, and to include plants that might grow in undisturbed areas but have an aggressive nature. This is from a very interesting article called Planet of Weeds that perhaps you saw in Harper's in 1998 by David Quammen. He says, weedy organisms, plant or animal, what that implies is a constellation of characteristics. They reproduce quickly, disperse widely when given a chance, tolerate a fairly broad range of habitat conditions, take hold in strange places, succeed especially in disturbed ecosystems. So there he's including Heiser's definition, but broadening it to have disturbance by any means. And they resist eradication once they're established. They're scrappers, generalists, and opportunists, and tend to thrive in human-dominated terrain because in crucial ways they resemble Homo sapiens. Aggressive, versatile, prolific, and ready to travel. So, by his definition, humans are weeds. And that makes me wonder if our relegation of weeds to a lowly status is some sort of self-loathing. And I think it might be, actually. He lists city pigeons, which are descended from a wild Eurasian bird, white-tailed deer, raccoons, cowbirds, all natives, along with kudzu and other plants that are commonly considered invasive. His definition has room for organisms that don't absolutely require disturbance, which can invade a forest or a lake, for example. And in his definition, weeds are still associated with people. And in both these cases, weeds are wild. Although they associate with us, they are not controlled by us. We don't plant them on purpose. We don't choose who will mate with who, as in breeding. And so they are companions, but not like a domesticated cat or a dog or horse. They are truly wild. They come and go as they please. And thus, I think as messengers, as organisms that might be telling us something about the changes in the world, they can tell us things we don't know. They thrive on change, disturbance, and yet they are really not us. I'm not saying that you can't learn things from your garden plants or your dog or your cat, but I think you can learn more from something that is just a little bit more different. So what are some of the things I've learned from my interactions with weeds? And I want to stress that in most of these cases, what I feel like I've been doing is observing and interacting with weeds but I've never really felt comfortable that I've had actual conversations with weeds at this point. So I'm not sure they've come to me with a message, but I certainly am not brushing them away at any point. I'm taking seriously the interaction. If I can have the slide, I don't think I'll need the lights. The next slide. This is velvet leaf, which is an important weed that has a leaf that is so soft that you'd like to be able to make a baby blanket out of it. And it's beautiful. The flower's a little bit inconspicuous. It's small compared to a lot of the members of the mallow family, but it has a beautiful clear yellow, and the seed pod is often called butterprint. And in Charlie Heiser's book, he says he doesn't think you could actually use it for putting in print and butter, but it reminded people of the kinds of prints people used to put in butter. And this is just to remind me, and you can turn the slide off now, that the first thing I learned was that weeds are beautiful. And this may seem trivial. I learned this when I was quite young. As was mentioned, my father was a florist, and he made flower arrangements that were meant to be beautiful. He grew flowers in a greenhouse, but my favorite thing to do was to go out with him to collect weeds. And we would walk for miles along the railroad track. We'd go into old cemeteries, abandoned fields. We'd trespass on people's property. And look for old, dead, dried up weeds, the seed pods of things. And the sort of thing that if you were looking from a moving car, you would just dismiss. But when you look at them carefully, there's just infinite variety in the shapes and the colors and the particular details of weeds. And I learned there that these were not waste places at all. There was nothing that I would define as waste about the sides of the railroad tracks. They were full of beauty, even at the end of the summer when all the flowers had withered, even in the cold wind. Later, I would be able to appreciate this beauty of all the life stages of a weed, in being able to let a weed stand long enough to serve as shelter or seed for the birds in the winter. And it's tempting sometimes when you're looking at your lawn and you see all of these kind of raggedy looking things to say, oh, it's time to cut that down. And to just give in to the idea that it isn't beautiful to be old. No, it's not. Okay. It's a weed calling. Okay. So actually, I don't think that's trivial, because I think aesthetics is something that we learn. You can learn to think something is ugly or beautiful, and a lot of the things that get in the way of us living sustainably have to do with getting over particular aesthetics that we've learned. Okay, the next thing that I learned, and if I can have the next slide just for a second here. This is my father beaming with pride in a basket full of wild grapes that he picked for free at Ninth Street Park. They aren't there anymore. They did a little renovation and cut down the vines. But in the next slide, you can see my own salad from my garden, from my lawn, with red bud flowers and dandelion greens, and I think there's some violets in there and so forth. Beautiful. I learned, you can turn it off now, I learned in early grade school that you could eat weeds. We had moved to Pennsylvania for a few years, and one of my neighbors, Mrs. Lightfoot, an American Indian, took me into the woods and along the edges of the lawn and taught me that there was food right out on the edge of the lawn. She taught me how to identify the plants and pick them and cook them at the right stage and that sort of thing. And I just couldn't get over it. I could not believe that everyone wasn't out there eating that stuff. Because it tasted good, it was free, you didn't have to go anywhere. But Mrs. Lightfoot and I were the only people I ever saw doing this. So, this again seems like a deceptively simple lesson, but to me this is another one of the most important things I learned, and that is that nature is abundant. When you live in a capitalist economy that's based on the idea of scarcity, and when you live in a place where food has been taken into that economy, you start thinking of nature as being stingy. When you go out and eat from it, and you notice that even after the caterpillars and the foxes and the birds and everything else is nibbled on it, there's still enough for you. It gives you a sense of security, and a sense of security in the world that I don't know how you get any other way. So I can't stress enough how important this was to me. The second thing I learned was that knowledge was the key to that abundance. In fact, I learned that if I didn't identify my needs correctly, I could kill myself eating them. And that is an interesting thing to learn as a kid. It's important to be able to distinguish poison hemlock from wild turnip, but even a child can learn this. And when you learn this as a child and you feel confident and you go out and make those life and death decisions for yourself, that gives you a security and a confidence in the world that has served me all of my life. And I've used it in inspecting the wild mushrooms for the farmers markets, keeping all of you safe from dying from poisonous mushrooms, and making medicines from wild plants and that sort of thing. If you want to get this feeling for yourself of an abundant universe, I suggest that you do look at a good book and go with someone who knows how to identify things. And I have some ideas of books if you're interested. Well, these were good, positive lessons to learn. Then I went into junior high school, when the life begins to be more complicated and perhaps less positive overall. If I can have the next slide. This is the house of some peace activists in Hawaii. And there's all kinds of vines and some bananas hanging there and an old dirty refrigerator and stuff piled up and junk all over the place. Can turn that off. I learned fairly quickly that people who like weeds are not good citizens. They tend to be lower class, have junk in their yards, maybe even have chickens in town. Nice people do not hang out with weeds. This realization didn't affect me too much at the time. My dad actually mowed the lawn, and although my hillbilly grandma prowled around looking for dandelions every spring, none of her kids did that I know of. And so it didn't really affect me. However, in my adult life, I found it helpful to live on the wrong side of the tracks if I want to consort with weeds. And it is one of those impediments to sustainable living also, that many of the things, putting your laundry out on the line, driving an old car, making do with secondhand things and so forth, are associated with poverty and lower classes. And even if it's something that you choose and that you feel good about and are enjoying, it still is a stigma that it needs to be overcome before more people will take up a lot of the practices of sustainable living. Well, society's message not to hang out with weeds fell on deaf ears with me. In high school, I began to root for weeds to take over the world. And it was the mid-late 60s, and civilization seemed to be falling apart. In quick succession, glimmers of hope were being extinguished. JFK, MLK, Malcolm X, cities on fire, rivers on fire, Vietnam. So the tenacity of weeds started to appeal to me. And if I can have the next slide. Could you focus that a little bit? Thank you. There's a weed growing in a crack in the sidewalk. And that became a symbol to me that in the most leak polluted, paved over areas, a seed would sprout and the concrete would buckle and a living green being would emerge. Life would prevail in the end. Failed civilizations would disappear under jungle vines. Yes! Ailanthus trees would push up through the broken tiles of abandoned tenements. Yes! Weeds shall overcome someday. So I'm not saying that in a trivial way. You know, it was a cute title. I didn't want to trivialize the civil rights movement. I associated that with the civil rights movement. To me, it represented hope. And I always felt that hope when I saw these lush, green, weedy areas in the most despondent parts of cities. It would be a good thing. New soil would be produced, insects and birds would return, weeds would heal the wounds in the earth, and life would go on. Weeds became my lifeline to an imaginable future. Now, this was in the middle of college. I moved to Oregon and didn't have a job and did some work as a farm laborer, like a migrant worker, and picking strawberries, weeding beans, that sort of thing. I saw that there was a war going on against weeds in industrial agriculture, and I was shocked at the attitudes and tactics. It was really the first time I experienced it firsthand. I will interject that during high school I was a professional weeder. Now, how can you want weeds to take over the world while you're being a professional weeder? Well, it was a botanical garden, and we didn't really have a war model of weeding. And it taught me that you can kill without hating something, which is a good thing since we have to kill to eat. We don't really hate our lettuce plants, for example, even though we kill them and eat them. That it is the only way for energy to move from one organism to another is by transforming one person's or organism's death into another person's life. So I didn't associate killing weeds with warfare or hate, but what I saw in the industrial agriculture fields did feel that way to me. If I can have the next slide, please. This is an ad from a agriculture magazine, and that's a bomber hooked up to sprays in an agricultural field. And this is for an herbicide, lightning. I believe it says you only need to strike once to kill all the weeds. So the imagery is overt. There's nothing hidden here. If you can turn that off. This bomber is symbolic, but the airplanes that sprayed pesticides over our house in Oregon were direct spin-offs of the defoliants and the machines used in Vietnam. We were living in a rented house in the middle of a bean field. I don't know what was being sprayed, but I'd listen for the planes and then run out and try and get the laundry off of the line before they got too close. And now we know even very small amounts of pesticides can have dramatic developmental and health effects because they can mimic hormones in very small quantities. They get into the water, they evaporate and concentrate in wild areas and so forth. So why the chemical weapons? Well, at least 3 things are at work in using chemical weed control, chemical weapons in agriculture. One is the industrialization of agriculture. Chemicals can wipe out weeds without much human labor. And the efficiency is measured in how much you can raise on an acre with how few people. It fits with mechanization in general. Then there's an aesthetic of clean fields that you don't want to just remove the weeds that are competing directly with your crop. You want to remove all of the weeds permanently because it looks better. And this is serious. There's a lot of pressure to have a clean field, and a lot of the ads will say, will play on that peer pressure. And I believe that that's the same thing that's operating in our lawns and so forth. In other words, although crops can be crowded by weeds and some control is necessary to get a high yield, total elimination of weeds isn't agronomically necessary. The third thing is that companies that make these pesticides can reap a very large profit from their widespread use. An example would be Roundup, Monsanto's signature herbicide, which, when it was still on patent, a quarter of their entire profit came from that one herbicide. So just like the blockbuster pharmaceuticals, it's important for them to keep these being used at a high level. And so they push them with education and advertising and other kinds of pressure. If I can have the next slide. As I said, this wasn't really hidden in any way. Here's a soybean dressed in a marine outfit, marine bean, this is called. And the genetics now is reinforcing the chemicals in that now plants are being bred to be resistant to particular herbicides so that you can plant a Roundup resistant soybean, for example, wait until the weeds come up with the soybean and then spray, and the soybean survives and the weeds die. So you're packaging the seeds with the weeds so that they can be efficient fighting machines. And this is done with nematodes, pictures of nematodes, which are tiny little soil microorganisms, the same size as a human, and duking it out in the fields, and with fungi and so forth. And the idea is it's us against them in agriculture. We have to keep all of those pests completely controlled, or if we misstep for even a second, if we don't keep up the arms race, they're going to take over. So you don't even have to know your enemy's names. The broad spectrum of herbicides kill them all. The only weed is a dead weed. You get the idea that the same attitude that's used in warfare is used against these weeds. And as in our war on terrorism, this war against weeds is only breeding more weeds. The weeds become resistant, they become hardier, they figure out ways to circumvent the different weapons that are used against them, and weeds will overcome. They just will. So it's an escalating situation. But back to relationships. Perhaps more important than the collateral damage from the war, the health effects, the environmental effects of the pesticides, for example, the different kinds of machines used, is the toll that it takes on our sense of our place in the world. As we build up the idea that everything out there is trying to get our scarce food, and that we have to have a good set of weapons and a big wall to keep the hordes away, we develop a siege mentality, we develop a sense of insecurity in the world, and a pessimism about things in general. We become lonelier and lonelier in our little compound as more and more of the organisms are classified as pests and weeds and diseases. This, to me, is the most tragic part of it. It takes a joy out of being in the world, away from people, as we try and seal our borders. The next slide This war, I wish I could say that in the 30 years since my house was sprayed in Oregon that there had been some kind of truce declared, but instead the war has spread to lawns, golf courses, waterways. More pesticides and more types of pesticides are being used than ever before. Crops, as I mentioned, are genetically engineered to withstand herbicides and have led to more herbicide applications. Here in Bloomington, here's True Green ChemLawn tree and shrub application. I've seen a definite increase in pesticide use in the urban areas. I think there are several reasons. More people hire lawn services. Private residences have been replaced with commercial buildings, apartment buildings, and so forth. Pretty much all hire lawn services. The waste places have become useful. Converting places that were left alone basically into places that are now managed often with herbicides. And a beautiful campus has become more of a commodity. IU has been using the idea of how beautiful our campus is and how well landscaped and how green the grass is to try and get more students to come here, and they're spending more money and time, and there are more people employed keeping it that way, and a lot of that involves the spraying of herbicides. Am I just cranky because I love weeds and I hate seeing them damaged like this? Maybe. But there are also serious health consequences, and I just want to, tell you the latest study, because it was kind of shocking to me, and I just found out about it last week. Maybe you haven't heard of it. And it's from Purdue, that bastion of weed lovers up there in West Lafayette. This is from the veterinary medicine school up there, and basically, I didn't realize this, but a friend of mine who's a veterinarian brought this to my attention, that since 1975, the prevalence of bladder cancer in dogs has increased 600-fold. 600-fold, just since 1975. There are particular breeds of dog that are unusually sensitive to getting bladder cancer, including Scottish Terriers, Shetland Sheepdogs, White-haired Fox Terriers, and so forth. And so there is some kind of a genetic predisposition, but often genetic predispositions are canaries in the coal mine. It's affecting everyone, but it's easier to see because more of the animals are getting the disease that are predisposed. And that was their theory. So they looked at Scottish Terriers, and they looked at several hundred of them, compared Scottish Terriers that had been diagnosed with bladder cancer to those that did not have bladder cancer but maybe had another ailment, and then questioned their owners about the habits of the dogs in the year before and so forth. And they found a very high correlation between lawn chemicals and in particular herbicides with the increase in bladder cancer. Actually, there was a 7-fold increase in bladder cancer amongst the dogs that had frequented pesticide-treated lawns the year before their diagnosis versus those that hadn't. That's pretty dramatic, and again, coming from Purdue, it is not suspected of being biased in the same way that it might be at some other places. They are now trying to figure out which pesticides, and it appears to be many of them, but particularly the phenoxy herbicides like 2,4-D and 2,4-D relatives, which is one of the major herbicides used on the planet, and in fact is used quite commonly here in town. A few years ago, for example, it was one of the ones in the mixture used at IU. So, when I walk through town, I would say more often than not, I'm walking by lawns that have been treated with herbicides. It's pretty easy to tell. When they're treated, I have pretty extreme reactions to walking by them. I feel sick and like I'm gonna faint. And it includes public places like the courthouse, the Monroe County Courthouse, or the Monroe County Library, the IU grounds, and I should say most of the commercial buildings. So I wouldn't walk on the grass there. There's a lot of evidence that when you track that into your house, it doesn't degrade as quickly as it would out in the sunlight and the rain. I wouldn't walk my dogs there. Kind of limits where you can go, really. And for what purpose? To kill dandelions. Useful plants, medicinal plants, beautiful plants, robust, energetic dandelions. So it's collateral damage in a senseless war in this case, that of course will not be won because the weeds will overcome. They're becoming resistant to all these herbicides, but will we become resistant to them? So, what has been my response to this? One of my responses is I grow a lot of my own food, organic food, where weeds are part of the system. In organic growing, you pull weeds, but you don't hate weeds. You are at war with weeds. If you're pulling them by organic means, you don't have enough energy to get rid of them all, even if you want to. So you're limited by your choice of technologies in a beneficial way. I patronize the organic growers at the farmers market, and I also promote a different lawn aesthetic. I try and teach people how to eat the weeds and so on, and take those lessons I learned as a child and extrapolate them into Bloomington. And this is a kind of peacemaking work for me. It's the way that I express my desire to live in a peaceful world. So how's it going? Well, from what I can tell, there's increasing polarization, as there is in society in general. More of us are practicing non-aggression against weeds, but others spray and cut more often, maybe in response. Who knows? So I've been worried about this war mentality, and I'm worried now, yet again, that it's spreading in a much more complex way into our own organic food eaters community, the environmentalists, in a war against alien plants. And that's the last thing I want to talk about. If I can have the next slide. Killer plants invade USA, they're strangling sleeping animals. This, of course, is from the National Examiner, a joke. But, the next slide. This is something that I know you can't read, but I want you to just be able to see the outline of it. The big warning, and now I'm going to read it to you. Warning. And this I got at the TC Steele State Historic Site when I went to give a wildflower walk at the Wildflower Foray 5 or 6 years ago. And I was handed a packet of these and told to hand them out to the people on the walk. And it said, "A picture-perfect paradise. Warning, aliens are invading our forests, prairies, and wetlands. They're crowding our native species and robbing our wildlife of food!" Exclamation point. Unite to eliminate these 5 most invasive aliens. And then it gives them bush honeysuckle, garlic mustard, Japanese honeysuckle, multiflora rose, and purple loosestrife. Their descriptions, how they invade, and then eradication, not control, not trying to keep them down, not so much eradication, cut to base. Use herbicides such as Roundup or Garland can also foliar spray after blooming, suggesting that we go out and spray these with herbicides so that our native forests and wildflowers will be safe. And frankly, I was shocked. I knew about this issue, and I knew that it was a serious issue in the environmental community. But I was asked to take a plastic bag for people to put the garlic mustard in that they pulled up, and then told that we were going to burn the garlic mustard in a big pile. And I smelled warfare. I detected hatred. I was shocked that herbicides might be used in our natural areas, and since then I've used that learned that they're used all over the national forests and so forth. And these were my friends the organic food eaters who were at war against some plants because of their love for other plants. Wow. Weeds shall overcome, and it might not be good. And the conservation community is pretty united in putting invasions by alien plants at the top of their concerns. The species and natural communities are changing, becoming more uniform, being crowded out. Our biodiversity is being threatened. And it's viewed as no other option but war to get rid of them. However, I really have never seen a plant I don't like. You know, I really like them all. And even though I'm willing to pull them, I wasn't willing to go to war just yet. So it's a complex issue. It's one with high emotions. Extinction is at stake, perhaps, for species. So let me just bring up the idea that maybe we could examine this the way we would examine any type of war and ask about the root causes of the conflict. And if I could have the next slide. Maybe war is not the answer. And I'm going to bring some things up in closing here that are controversial and that I'm not positive about, but that feel like they need to be brought into the open, at least from my viewpoint. What are the root causes of these invasions? As with any other analysis, it's nice to start with a little history. And I want to recommend a book I've read before, but which just came out in a new edition. It's called Ecological Imperialism, The Biological Expansion of Europe 900 to 1900 by Alfred W. Crosby. And the new edition just came out this year. He has a very interesting way of thinking about these invasions, which have been going on for at least 500 years. He feels it's necessary to start back about 200 million years ago to understand the current redistribution of organisms. So he says, 200 million years ago, there was a series of geological events that brought lands to their present locations. 200 million years ago, when dinosaurs were still lolling about, all the continents were jammed together in one great supercontinent that geologists call Pangaea. And he talks about how at that point there weren't really any barriers to the movement of animals and plants through all of the continents, other than their particular ecological requirements. Then about 180 million years ago, Pangaea began to break up, like some immense tabular iceberg rotting in the heat of the Gulf Stream. First it split into two supercontinents, and then into smaller units that became the continents we know today. And then evolution became what he calls centrifugal. Species began evolving away from each other and becoming distinct and forming the diverse complexity that we see today. His insight that I had never really thought about before was that when primarily it was the Europeans developed the technology to move between the continents on their sailing ships during the age of exploration in the 14 and 1500s. They reunited Pangaea. Right at the beginning, they took with them all kinds of plants and animals, dumped them off on all the continents and a lot of the islands. Cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, all the weeds that were in their stomachs, rats, and so forth. And these animals spread through particularly South and North America and Australia ahead of European settlement itself. In waves of invasions that were often very dramatic and some of them unexpected. So for example, did you know that oranges were a major invading organism in Venezuela? or that peaches were a terrible weed in North Carolina. They aren't anymore, but it was interesting to me to realize how long these things have been going on and how dramatic, the dramatic effect of the herds of horses, how radically they changed the landscape and the relationships between the organisms. So with the horses, it was particularly interesting because horses had been here before, and then during one of the Ice Age periods, they disappeared, and now they were back. So are they native or not? And that sort of thing. So there are lots of interesting questions. But the insight for me was that this kind of dramatic change has been going on for quite a while now, and it doesn't show any signs of abating as long as we keep those links between the continents, as long as we keep Pangea together with our technologies. And I don't really see any change in that. It's accelerated, if anything, with air travel and with the numbers of people traveling with the various types of conveyances and so forth. In many cases, Crosby thinks weeds followed the animals to the new continents and actually mitigated the effects of the animals on the ecosystems. And let me just read one other thing from Crosby. He says, it's probably necessary at this point to explain why the entire land surface of the globe isn't covered with plankton and the like. Colonizing plants, weeds, can only survive in really anything but success. As they take over disturbed ground, they stabilize the soil, block the baking rays of the sun, and for all their competitiveness, make it a better place for other plants than it was before. Weeds are the Red Cross of the plant world. They deal with ecological emergencies. When the emergencies are over, they give way to plants that may grow more slowly, but grow taller and sturdier. In fact, weeds find it difficult to elbow into undisturbed environments, and they usually die out if disturbances cease. And then he talks about evidence for that, and says, this is another insight to me. Weeds thrive on radical change, not stability. Weeds thrive on radical change, not stability. Now, what about these alien invasive plants? Are they weeds in the sense that they need disturbance? We've been making a distinction that they're the plants that invade undisturbed areas, but maybe they're thriving on radical change in those undisturbed areas. Maybe they're the flies that are here to tell us about the cataclysm. And I have a little bit of evidence for that. And it's kind of depressing, but let me just give one quick example. Australia, there's been an increase in the prevalence of insect diseases on the native eucalyptus. Apparently, the leaves have become more nutritious because the surrounding pastures where the sheep are being raised are being fertilized so that the pasture grasses grow better. And Australia has old, nutrient-poor soils that the eucalyptus has evolved on. When they are fertilized, they have fewer insect-fighting compounds in their leaves and higher nutrition. They become less resistant to insects. The insects cause them to weaken and die. So they're declining because of this increase in fertilization. Should we spray them with pesticides to kill the insects? I don't think so. That's not the cause of their decline. It's an indication of their decline. But the cause is the change in fertilization. So, right now, nitrogen is fertilizing the whole globe. The pollutants from our combustion of fossil fuels and other fertilizers that we use in agriculture are evaporating and then falling on the forests and the waterways and gradually increasing the nutrient levels everywhere. A lot of our native plants are tuned to living on nutrient-poor soils. And a lot of the weeds love nutrition. So we're giving a competitive advantage to those weeds, and those natural areas have been disturbed by the fertilization, and we may not even know it. A lot of the recently invading plants like privet have been in the area for 150 years without really invading into the natural areas, and all of a sudden they're all over the place in the forest. What change has occurred? And we need to be looking at that. Can we do anything about those changes? Maybe not. Maybe it's too late for a lot of those things by the time we notice it. For example, global warming. Not that we shouldn't try and decrease the activities that contribute to global warming so that it's less extreme. But if we stopped emissions now, for the next 200 years, there would still be warming. And the warming that would occur if we stopped emissions now is enough to greatly disturb most of the ecosystems that we're familiar with. So to me, it's a sad thing to see the decline of our natural diversity. But unless I'm convinced that the plants that are moving into those areas are the cause of it and not just the indication of it, I do not want to go to war. Particularly when the war does have collateral damage, both in our attitudes and in the physical aspects of spraying herbicides and so forth. Again, I look to the past. There have been hundreds of dramatic changes in the history of the earth that you might call cataclysms. And at least 5 times in the last couple billion years, there have been mass extinctions on the scale that many biologists predict for now. 35% of species, 85% of species disappearing. Some appear to have happened very quickly. A lot of times I hear, oh, but nothing has ever happened as fast as we're making it happen. Well, what about a meteorite hitting the Earth? And, that's instantaneous, blotting out the sun. We're puny compared to that. So I'm not trying to belittle the effects that we're having on the Earth. I'm trying to be hopeful, even though it may not sound like that. It has never been an apocalypse. The world has always emerged from these cataclysms and re-established diversity. In fact, had we organic food eaters been around during the last 65 million year extinction when the dinosaurs disappeared, we might have tried to save the dinosaurs by stomping on the egg-eating animals, the mammals that were all around the feet of the dinosaurs. And had we succeeded, what would have happened in the subsequent rebirth of life? So let me suggest this. Maybe some of the invaders will end up diversifying into our next native species, co-evolving with others in their new habitats. I'm back to being happy that weeds will overcome someday, even if the someday is 5 to 10 million years from now. Is that hopeful? So maybe you're still back at the mass extinction part and it's our fault. And I don't want to minimize the sadness of that. And I want to, I've just got a few more minutes here. I want to read something that kind of captures that for me. This is by Gary Lawless, who's a poet from Maine, a bioregionalist, trying to capture the sadness of these extinctions that we're undoubtedly going to be witnessing over and over again. You are the last whale, washed up on a far beach. The waves are pushing against you. Your brothers and sisters are gone. The light is too bright for your eyes. You cannot breathe. Small children are throwing rocks and laughing, climbing onto your body. You die alone, your ears full of wind. You are the last buffalo. The sun is setting over the plains. You stand alone, enormous, heavy with fur, lonely. You're tired of running. All your friends have gone. It seems the earth has turned against you. There's not one to say goodbye. You rest, listening to the wind. When the time is right, the spirit of the wolf returns. And I don't think we know where the spirit of the wolf will return, but I am hopeful that it will. So how do we move forward from that sadness and live with the changes that are already occurring, many of which we cannot change? That, I believe, is the challenge that we should be addressing with our quest for simply living. My job, and it's not an easy one, is to live in such a way that I'm a partner with the reflourishing of life. I don't think it's my job to try and manage, control, or predict the future of life. And I don't think I need to try and reconstruct the past. What a relief. What a relief. I'm not in charge of the world, which is a good thing because I don't think people have the aptitude for managing the planet. I do think that it's important for us to participate in the world with the other species as co-actors. It's not a hands-off. How does one listen to non-human nature in the world without just projecting our own thoughts onto it? How do we know that when we think that the dandelion is saying this and that, it's not just us projecting that onto it? In many cultures, particular people were trained for the work of listening as shamans, for example. Without such a tradition, how do we know when we've created a dialogue with the others that is real? We need to try, yet I think it's easy to be deluded. Weeds are good teachers, they live close by, yet they're wild. Weeds change, they move, they come and go in patterns that carry a lot of information. Even if we're just observing them and not actually having them come to us, I think we can still learn a lot, but we need to let them grow near us without controlling them, and then watch and see what happens to them and what happens to you. And so it's a tiny little step, but I would urge you to just let some small place go and see what happens. I'm humbled by the change. I don't have a clue what will happen, which organisms will go extinct and which will prosper into the future. Somehow I think humans and weeds will go together into the future. I think we're the adaptable type, but who knows? But what does that mean for now? What does that mean for us and sustainable living? I do know that now our various wars against nature are culminating in suffering and ill health and sorrow, and a feeling of being alone in the world. And so the things we need to do today to make peace with the world are the same things that are going to allow life to flourish in the future. So I think the idea is to pay really close attention to what we're doing today. Consider the lilies of the field. They neither reap nor sow, and yet they're taken care of, as you will be. You don't need to worry about tomorrow. There's enough problem today. And if we focus on those, they're going to be the same solutions that we need in the future. For example, with cars and the exhaust and the global warming. It smells bad. It causes asthma. It's already caused global warming. Whether or not it's cataclysmic for the future, it's already a problem for organisms today. So the oil burned in cars is already causing destruction of rainforests in the Amazon and fueling wars in the Middle East. So based on what we know today, we should get rid of car exhaust. So we don't have to predict the future. Other people at other times have faced cataclysmic futures, and perhaps they have some wisdom in how to do it. Maybe we can learn from them. Various times when people have faced a feeling that there's a big change, and in fact there has been. A poet, M.J. Slim Hui, says it this way: From this day onward, I will walk easy on the earth, plant trees, kill no living things, live in harmony with all creatures. I will restore the earth where I am, use no more of its resources than I need, and listen to what it is telling me. I think that's what we'll be doing at the Simply Living Fair, trying to figure those things out. And I hope you'll make a special place in your heart for weeds. Thank you.